Every November, it brought great hardship to the town of Copper Ridge, Montana, because the snow that fell during these months always covered the entire town in a blanket of white. Margaret stood on the sagging porch of the company house that had been her home for 8 years, watching as her few possessions, a dented pot, 2 threadbare blankets, a wooden crate of her children's clothes, landed in the snow with muffled thuds that sounded like the closing of coffin lids. Howard Brennan, her brother-in-law, stood in the doorway with his arms crossed over his barrel chest. He had a stiff, angry expression on his face and a look that showed he was completely determined to carry out his decision. Behind him, the warm glow of the coal stove that Margaret had fed every morning for 8 years mocked her with its heat, a warmth she and her 7 children would never feel again. "You've got until the company wagon comes through at 3 o'clock, Howard said, his breath fogging in the bitter air. "After that, I'm boarding up the window. Can't have squatters making the place look occupied when the new foreman moves in next week." Margaret felt the words like physical blows, each one landing with the weight of betrayal. It had been only 6 weeks since the cave-in, 6 weeks since they'd pulled Robert's body from the collapsed tunnel in the Brennan copper mine, his chest crushed by Montana granite, his hands still gripping the pickaxe he'd been swinging when the mountain decided to take him. 6 weeks of grief so raw it felt like her skin had been peeled away, leaving her nerves exposed to every cruel wind that blew through this godforsaken town. And now this, eviction, cast out by the very man whose mine had killed her husband, whose copper had been extracted with Robert's sweat and ultimately his blood. "Howard, please." Margaret hated the pleading in her voice, hated that she had to beg, but 7 pairs of eyes watched her from behind the torn curtain of the neighbor's window. Her children, ranging from 14-year-old Rose down to 2-year-old Samuel, all of them depending on her to perform miracles she didn't know how to conjure. Just until spring, the children, it's too cold for them to be. "The children aren't my problem, Margaret." Howard's voice was flat, final, carrying the same cold efficiency he used when firing miners who'd been injured and could no longer work. Robert knew the risks when he went down in that shaft. Every man does. That's why the company provides housing while they're employed. Employed, Margaret, past tense now. He stepped back and began to close the door, then paused, as if remembering something unpleasant he had to deliver. "There's something else. The equipment Robert was using when the tunnel collapsed. The company's saying it was damaged. Negligence on his part, they're calling it. They've calculated the cost of replacement and, well," he pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket and held it out like a weapon. "Says here you owe Brennan Copper $273 for damage." The number hit Margaret like a sledgehammer. $273. More money than she'd see in 5 years, even if she could find work, which she couldn't because no one in Copper Ridge hired women for anything but laundry or cooking, and those positions were already filled by women whose husbands were still alive to provide for them. "That's a lie." Margaret's voice shook, not with fear, but with rage that burned hotter than the stove she was being denied. "Robert maintained his equipment better than any man in that mine. You know it, Howard. Everyone knows it. The collapse was because your boss refused to install proper supports. 3 men warned him that shaft was unstable." "Careful, Margaret." Howard's eyes went hard as the copper ore his mine produced. "You start spreading accusations about the company's safety standards, you'll find yourself not just homeless, but unemployable anywhere in Montana. Brennan Copper has a long memory and a longer reach. Now get your things and get moving. I've been more than generous giving you 6 weeks." The door slammed shut with a finality that echoed across the snow-covered street. Margaret stood frozen for a moment, feeling the cold seep through the worn soles of her boots, through the thin fabric of her dress, into her bone. Around her, other doors remained firmly closed. The neighbors who'd borrowed sugar from her, whose children had played with hers, who'd come to her when they needed a hem repaired or a fever treated with her herb remedies, all of them invisible now, afraid that helping the widow would cost them their own tenuous positions in the company town. Copper Ridge was a town that belonged entirely to Brennan Copper. Every house, every store, every job, every breath of smoke from every chimney existed at the company's pleasure. Cross the company, and you found yourself not just unemployed, but exiled, blacklisted from every mining operation in the state. The fear was so thick you could taste it, metallic and bitter, like the copper dust that coated everything. Margaret turned to gather her children in their pitiful belongings, her mind racing through impossible calculations. Where could they go? The nearest town was 15 miles away through mountain passes that were already becoming impassable with snow. She had no money. Robert's last wages had gone to the company store for food and coal. She had no family except Howard, and he'd made his position crystal clear. The church might take them in for a night or two, but Father McKinnon had 8 other families already sheltering in the basement, refugees from other company evictions, and his charity was stretched to the breaking point. It was Rose who saw the man first. "Mama, someone's coming." Margaret looked up to see a figure trudging through the snow toward their house, his black coat and bent posture marking him as someone apart from the miners and company men. As he drew closer, she recognized Emmett Wall, the town's only lawyer, a wizened man of 70 who'd been practicing law in Copper Ridge since before the copper boom, back when this had been just another nameless valley in the mountains. He approached without preamble, his roomy eyes taking in the scene with a sadness that suggested he'd witnessed this particular tragedy play out too many times before. From his coat, he withdrew a large envelope, yellow with age, sealed with red wax that had cracked with time. "Mrs. Margaret Brennan," he said formally, his voice carrying a strange weight. "I have something for you, a matter of inheritance." Margaret stared at the envelope as if it might bite her. Inheritance? From whom? Robert's parents had been dead for 15 years, and they left nothing but debt. Not from Robert's family, Emmett said quietly, glancing at Howard's closed door with distaste. From Victoria Ashford, or as the locals called her, the Copper Queen. The name sent a chill through Margaret that had nothing to do with the November cold. Everyone in Copper Ridge knew about Victoria Ashford, though most only spoke of her in whispers. The woman who discovered the richest copper vein in Montana back in 1898. The woman who'd built an empire and then vanished without a trace in 1912, leaving behind only her mansion, empty, abandoned, and according to every soul in town, cursed beyond redemption. "I don't understand," Margaret said slowly. "I never knew Victoria Ashford. How could she leave me anything?" Emmett's expression suggested he'd been asking himself the same question. "Her will was very specific. It states that if she should die or disappear without direct heirs, her property, the Ashford Estate, all mineral rights and associated lands, should pass to the first widow of a Brennan mine who finds herself cast out with children to protect and nowhere to turn. That's you, Miss Brennan. By law and by the terms of the will, you now own the Ashford Estate." Margaret felt the world tilt slightly. The Ashford Estate, the mansion on Widow's Peak, 3 miles up the mountain road that no one used anymore, that no one dared to use. The house that every child in Copper Ridge was warned away from, where lights allegedly flickered in empty windows and sounds of machinery echoed from below ground, though no machines had run there in 40 years. That place is, Margaret stopped herself before saying cursed, aware of her children list. That place has been abandoned for decades. It must be falling apart. "The structure is sound," Emmett said, though his tone suggested he was repeating information rather than personal observation. "The will includes a trust that's been maintained for property taxes and basic preservation. There's no debt against it, no lien. It's yours free and clear, if you'll take it. If you'll take it." The words hung in the cold air, acknowledging what everyone knew. The Ashford Estate wasn't a gift. It was a dare. It was a place where Victoria Ashford had conducted experiments that the town had called witchcraft, where she'd built machines that shouldn't have worked but did, where she'd defied every convention about what a woman could or should do. And then one day she'd simply vanish, leaving behind a mansion that groaned and thumped through the night, that seemed to breathe with a life of its own. Margaret looked at her children, huddled together against the cold. At Rose, trying so hard to be brave. At Jacob and Peter, their thin faces pinched with hunger they tried to hide. At Anna, Mary, and Lucy, the middle girls who'd stopped laughing weeks ago. At baby Samuel, too young to understand why the world had turned so cold and cruel. She looked at Howard's closed door, at the neighbors' closed doors, at the closed doors of this entire company town that had decided she was disposed. Then she looked at Emmett Walsh and the envelope he held, at the key to a cursed mansion that represented her only option beyond freezing to death in a ditch. "I'll take it," Margaret said, her voice steady for the first time since Robert died. "Whatever's waiting up there, we'll face it together." Emmett handed her the envelope with something that might have been respect or might have been pity flickering in his old eyes. "The key's inside. The will and deed are there too. You're the legal owner now, Margaret. No one can take that from you, not even Brennan Copper." As the lawyer trudged away through the snow, Margaret opened the envelope with numb fingers. Inside was indeed an iron key, heavy and ornate, along with documents written in elegant script. But there was something else. A letter, addressed in a feminine hand, to the widow who comes after me. Margaret didn't read it then. There would be time for that later, in whatever shelter the Ashford Estate provided. Right now, she had to gather her children and begin the 3-mile trek up the mountain before the early winter darkness fell. The wagon she managed to borrow from the livery, payment to be worked off in laundry, she promised, was rickety and pulled by a swayback horse that looked as defeated as Margaret felt. They loaded their possessions in silence, the children moving with the exhausted efficiency of those who'd learned too young that life was a series of losses to be endured. As they pulled away from the company house, Margaret didn't look back. There was nothing behind them worth remembering. Only forward now, toward the dark shape of Widow's Peak rising against the gray November sky, toward the mansion that everyone said was haunted, toward whatever fate awaited them in the house of the Copper Queen. The road up the mountain was barely passable, choked with snow and overgrown with 40 years of neglect. The horse struggled, and twice they had to get out, push the wagon through drifts. The children were silent, except for occasional whimpers from Samuel, who Margaret held against her chest, trying to share what little body heat she had. As they climbed higher, the temperature dropped and the snow fell more heavily, each flake feeling like a cold finger pressing against exposed stained skin. The forest closed in around them, dark pines heavy with snow, their branches creaking in the wind with sounds that could have been warnings or welcomes. Margaret couldn't tell which. It was nearly dark when the Ashford Estate finally came into view, and Margaret's first sight of it made her breath catch in her throat. It wasn't the ruin she'd expected. The mansion stood 3 stories tall, built of dark wood and Montana stone, its architecture Victorian and imposing, with a tower that rose even higher on the eastern corner. The windows windows were intact, reflecting the dying light like watchful eyes. The roof showed no gaps or sag. The structure looked solid, maintained, as if someone had been caring for it all these years, though Margaret knew that was impossible. But it was the sound that made her skin prickle with an instinctive fear older than reason. Even from outside, even through walls and snow, she could hear it. Tump, 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 a deep rhythmic pounding that seemed to come from beneath the earth itself. Not random, not chaotic, but steady as a heartbeat. The sound of something massive, mechanical, or maybe living, beating away in the darkness under the house. The children heard it too. She felt them press closer to her, their small hands gripping her coat. "Mama," Rose whispered, her voice tight with fear. "What is that?" Margaret had no answer. She only had the key in her pocket, the night falling fast around them, in the certain knowledge that whatever waited inside that house, whatever made that terrible rhythmic pounding, they had no choice but to face it, because behind them lay certain death from cold and hunger, and ahead lay the unknown. Sometimes, Margaret thought as she urged the reluctant horse toward the mansion's front entrance, the unknown is the only hope we have left. The key turned smoothly in the lock, as if it had been waiting 40 years for exactly this moment. The door swung open on hinges that barely creaked, revealing darkness beyond. And from that darkness, steady and strong and terrifying, the pounding continued. Tump, tump, tump. Margaret took a deep breath, pulled her children close, and stepped across the threshold into the house of the Copper Queen. Whatever was waiting in the darkness beneath their feet, they would face it together. They had nowhere else to go. The interior of the Ashford Estate greeted them with a silence that was somehow louder than any scream. Margaret's hand trembled as she struck a match, the tiny flame casting dancing shadows across an entrance hall that seemed to stretch into infinity. The matchlight revealed walls paneled in dark wood, a grand staircase that curved upward into blackness, and furniture covered with white sheets that looked like gathered ghosts waiting for permission to move. But it was the temperature that struck her most forcefully, not the bone-chilling cold she'd expected from an abandoned house in November, but something closer to cool, as if some residual warmth lingered in the walls despite 40 years of emptiness. The air smelled of dust and time, but also of something else, something mechanical and oily, like a workshop or factory floor. And beneath everything, constant and unavoidable, was that sound. Tump, tump, tump. It vibrated through the floorboards under Margaret's feet, a rhythm so steady it could have been a metronome, so deep it seemed to resonate in her chest cavity. The children clustered around her like frightened birds, their eyes wide in the flickering matchlight, their breath forming small clouds in the air. "Where's it coming from, Mama?" Jacob whispered, his 10-year-old voice cracking with fear. Margaret didn't answer because she didn't know. The sound seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere, from the walls themselves, from below, from the very foundation of the house. It was as if the building had a heart, and that heart was beating, slow and measured and completely wrong. The match burned down to her fingers, forcing her to drop it. In the brief moment of darkness before she could light another, the pounding seemed to grow louder, more insistent, as if whatever made the sound knew they were there and was announcing its presence. "We need light," Margaret said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Rose, help me look for lamp. There must be oil lamps somewhere in this house. The rest of you, stay together, stay close to the door." She and Rose moved deeper into the entrance hall, feeling their way along the walls, lighting matches one after another, each tiny flame revealing more of the house that would now be their home or their tomb. Margaret wasn't sure which yet. They found a table, and on it, as if placed there deliberately for exactly this moment, sat an oil lamp with a full reservoir and a box of long matches beside it. Margaret's hands shook as she lit the lamp's wick. The warm glow that spilled forth revealed details that the matchlight had only hinted at. The entrance hall was magnificent, or had been once. The wood paneling was carved with intricate patterns of copper leaves and vines. A chandelier hung overhead, its crystal prisms catching the lamplight and scattering it across the walls in tiny rainbows. The furniture, though shrouded, had the heavy, expensive look of pieces built to last generations. But there was also evidence of long abandon. Dust lay thick on every surface, undisturbed for decades except where their footsteps had marked it. Spiderwebs draped the corners like tattered curtains. And most disturbingly, there were no personal effects, no photographs on the wall, no books on the side table, no coat hanging by the door. It was as if Victoria Ashford had removed every trace of her personality before she vanished, leaving behind only the shell of a life, empty and echoing. "Let's find the kitchen," Margaret said, trying to sound practical and unafraid. "We need to start a fire, get warm, figure out what we have to work with." The children followed her through the ground floor, their footsteps loud on the hardwood floors, the lamp casting their shadows huge and distorted on the walls. They passed through a formal dining room with a table that could seat 20, a library with empty bookshelves that stretched to the ceiling, a sitting room with furniture still arranged as if waiting for guests who would never arrive. And everywhere that sound, tump, 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 never varying, never stopping, a mechanical heartbeat that made it impossible to forget, even for a moment, that something was very wrong with this house. The kitchen, when they found it, was surprisingly modern for a house built in the previous century. A cast iron stove dominated one wall, its surface clean as if it had been scrubbed yesterday rather than 40 years ago. Copper pots and pans hung from hooks, their surfaces dulled with age but still solid and usable. The pantry, to Margaret's shock and desperate relief, wasn't entirely empty. There were jars of preserved food, some of them surely spoiled after 40 years, but others, sealed properly, might still be edible. There was flour in a sealed tin, weevil-free. There were even a few pieces of coal in the bin next to the stove. "It's like she knew," Rose said quietly, standing at Margaret's elbow and surveying the kitchen with eyes that seemed too old for her 14 years. "Like she left this for someone who would need it." Margaret didn't answer, but she felt the same eerie sensation. This wasn't a house that had been abandoned in panic or desperation. This was a house that had been prepared, staged, left ready for some future occupant. The question was, had Victoria Ashford done this deliberately before she vanished, or had someone else been maintaining the property all these years? She pushed the unsettling thoughts aside. Right now, they needed fire and food, in that order. The children were shivering, their lips starting to show that dangerous blue tinge that spoke of hypothermia's approach. Margaret worked quickly, her hands remembering the countless times she'd started fires in the company house, and within minutes, she had a small blaze going in the kitchen stove. The warmth it produced was like a benediction, like proof that they might actually survive the night. The children crowded around it, holding their hands out to the heat, and Margaret saw color begin to return to their faces. She opened one of the preserved jars, peaches, miraculously unspoiled, and divided the contents among them, just a few slices each, but the first food they'd had since morning. As the children ate and warmed themselves, Margaret allowed herself a moment to think, to assess their situation. They had shelter, they had some food, they had fuel for fire, at least for a few days. These were tangible advantages, more than they'd had this morning when Howard threw them out. But they also had that sound, that relentless pounding from below, and whatever it represented. They had a house that, by all accounts, was cursed or haunted or worse. They had winter closing in, 3 miles from the nearest town, with no way to get help if something went wrong. "Mama," it was Peter, the 8-year-old, his voice small and frightened. "Why does the house have a heartbeat?" Out of the mouths of babes, Margaret thought, because that's exactly what it sounded like. A heartbeat, too slow and too regular to be human, but undeniably organic in its rhythm. Tum, tum, tum. The house was alive, or something in it was alive, and they were sleeping in its belly night. "I don't know, sweetheart," Margaret admitted, deciding that honesty was better than lies her children would see. "But whatever it is, it's been doing this for 40 years without hurting anyone. The house is still standing. The sound hasn't destroyed anything. Maybe it's just old pipes or wind through tunnel," or the lie stuck in her throat. She didn't believe it was pipes or wind, and neither would her children. But what else could she tell? That they were trapped in a house with some kind of mechanical monster beneath it? That the famous Copper Queen, the woman who defied every convention and built an empire, had left behind something that no one understood and everyone feared? "We'll figure it out in the morning," Margaret said firmly, ending the discussion. "Right now, we need to sleep. We need to rest and get warm and gather our strength. Tomorrow, we'll explore properly, understand what we're dealing with. But tonight, we stay together. We stay warm and we stay safe." She gathered them in the kitchen, the warmest room in the house, and arranged them on the floor near the stove. The blankets they'd brought were thin, but the children huddled together for warmth, creating a nest of body heat and desperate hope. Margaret positioned herself between them and the door, her body as barrier against whatever might come through it. Though she had no weapon beyond a kitchen knife she'd slipped into her pocket. As the fire in the stove died down to embers and the children's breathing deepened into sleep, Margaret found herself unable to rest. The sound from below wouldn't let her. Tum, tum, tum. It was hypnotic, maddening, like Chinese water torture, but with sound instead of water. Each beat driving home the reality that they were not alone in this house, that something existed beneath them, active and purposeful and utterly mysterious. She thought about Victoria Ashford, the Copper Queen. What little Margaret knew came from town gossip and old newspaper stories, fragments of a legend that had grown distorted over 40 years. Victoria had arrived in Copper Ridge in 1895, a widow herself with money from back east and engineering knowledge that no woman should have possessed according to the standards of the day. She'd surveyed the mountains, identified the richest copper deposits through some method no one understood, and started mining operations that made her wealthier than any man in Montana. But she hadn't been content with just wealth. The story said she'd built machines, contraptions that processed ore more efficiently than anything else in the territory. She'd designed hydraulic systems that shouldn't have worked but did. She'd turned her mansion into a laboratory, a workshop, a place where the boundaries between possible and impossible blurred. The locals had called her a witch, had said she'd made deals with darker powers, had whispered that no woman could be that intelligent unless she'd sold her soul. And then, in 1912, she'd vanished. Not gradually, not with preparation or warning. One day she was there, operating her mines and her machines. The next day, she was gone. No body was ever found. No note was left. Her employees arrived at work to find the mines locked and silent, the mansion empty, and Victoria Ashford erased from the world as completely as if she'd never existed. The mystery had never been solved. Some said she'd fled to avoid scandal or danger. Others claimed she'd been murdered by competitors and her body hidden where it would never be found. The most popular theory, the one that turned her mansion mansion into a place of fear and superstition was that one of her experiments had gone wrong, that she'd opened a door that shouldn't be opened, and that door had swallowed her whole. Margaret shook her head, trying to clear away the morbid thoughts. Superstition and ghost stories, that's all it was. Victoria had probably just grown tired of small-town prejudice and moved somewhere more accepting, letting the locals invent whatever crazy theories they wanted. But even as she told herself this, the sound continued. Tump, tump, tump. And with each beat, Margaret felt more certain that understanding that sound was the key to understanding everything else about this house and its vanished owner. She must have dozed off eventually, because she woke with a start to find weak gray light filtering through the kitchen window. Dawn, or what passed for dawn in Montana winter, when the sun barely cleared the mountain peaks. The children were still asleep, exhausted by yesterday's trauma and the long, cold walk up the mountain. The fire in the stove had gone out, and the temperature in the kitchen had dropped significantly, and the sound had changed. Margaret sat up sharply, listening. The steady tump, tump, tump was still there, but now there was something else. A grinding, scraping sound, like metal against stone, like gears that hadn't been oiled in years being forced to turn. It came and went, irregular where the pounding was regular, and it seemed to be getting louder, as if whatever made it was moving, coming closer to the surface. She rose quietly, careful not to wake the children, and moved toward the sound. It led her to a door she hadn't noticed the night before, partially hidden behind a tall cabinet in the corner of the kitchen. The door was made of heavy oak, reinforced with iron bands, and it was locked with a padlock that looked newer than anything else in the house, maybe 10 or 15 years old rather than 40. Margaret tried the lock, but it held firm. She examined the door frame, looking for weakness, and that's when she noticed something that made her blood run cold. There were scratch marks on the wood around the lock, deep gouges as if someone or something had tried to claw their way through from the other side. The grinding sound came again, louder now, definitely from beyond this door, from whatever lay beneath the house. And for just a moment, Margaret could have sworn she heard something else mixed in with the mechanical noises. A voice, distant and distorted, calling out words she couldn't quite make out. "Hello," Margaret called, her voice barely above a whisper, feeling foolish but unable to stop herself. "Is someone down there?" The grinding stopped abruptly. The sudden silence was somehow worse than the noise had been. Even the steady tump, tump, tump seemed to pause, as if the house itself was holding its breath, listening. Then, from below came a single loud bang, like a sledgehammer striking metal, and the pounding resumed, faster now, more urgent. Tump, 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 tump. The rhythm that had been steady as a heartbeat was now racing, agitated, and the entire house seemed to vibrate with it. Margaret backed away from the door, her heart hammering in her chest to match the sound below. Behind her, the children were stirring, woken by the change in the noise, their faces showing the fear that she was trying so hard to keep off her own. "Mama?" Rose's voice was thick with sleep and terror. "What's happening?" Margaret turned to face her children, these 7 souls who depended on her to keep them safe, to make sense of the senseless, to find hope in the hopeless. She looked at their frightened faces and made a decision. "I'm going to find out," she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "But not today. Today we're going to explore the rest of the house, find out what we have to work with, make this place as livable as possible. We're going to eat and stay warm and rest. And tomorrow, when we're stronger, when we're ready, I'm going to open that door and see what's down there." "But what if it's dangerous?" Jacob asked. "What if whatever's down there comes up?" "Then we'll face it," Margaret said simply. "We'll face it together, because that's what we do. We face things. We don't run anymore. We don't have anywhere left to run to. This is our home now, and whatever's in the basement, whatever's making that sound, we're going to understand it, and we're going to make peace with it, or we're going to stop it, one way or another." She said it with more confidence than she felt, but her children needed confidence more than they needed truth. They needed to believe their mother had a plan, had control, had the strength to protect them from whatever horrors this house held, even if Margaret herself wasn't sure she believed it. The pounding below continued, faster than before, as if in response to her words, as if whatever made that sound had heard her challenge, accepted it. Margaret fed her children the last of the preserved peaches and began to explore the house properly, mapping their new domain room by room, looking for anything that might help them survive not just the winter, but whatever other trials the Ashford Estate had in store. And all the while, from beneath their feet, the copper heart of the mansion beat its urgent, unnatural rhythm, keeping time to a song only it understood. The exploration of the Ashford Estate took most of the morning, and with each room they entered, Margaret felt her understanding of Victoria Ashford shift and deepen. This wasn't just a mansion, it was a statement, a declaration of independence carved in wood and stone, a middle finger raised to every man who'd ever told a woman what she couldn't do. The ground floor alone held wonders that made Margaret's breath catch. Beyond the kitchen and dining room, they found a library whose empty shelves still smelled faintly of leather and paper, as if the ghost of knowledge lingered even after the books themselves had been removed. There was a conservatory with tall windows facing south, where the pale winter sun managed to penetrate and warm the air enough that a few hardy plants, long dead but still standing in their pots, bore witness to Victoria's love of growing things. But it was the study that truly revealed the woman who'd built this empire. Unlike the other rooms, this one hadn't been stripped bare. anywhere. The heavy desk remained, its surface scarred with the ink stains and the marks of compass points where Victoria had drawn her engineering plan. The walls were covered with maps, topographical surveys of the surrounding mountains, geological charts marking ore deposits, detailed drawings of mining equipment and hydraulic systems. Above the fireplace hung the only personal item Margaret had found so far, a portrait of Victoria Ashford herself. Margaret stood before it, studying the face of the woman who'd left her this strange inheritance. Victoria looked to be in her 40s when the portrait was painted, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to see through pretense and nonsense. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, and she wore a man's work shirt rather than the elaborate dresses fashionable at the time. There was no softness in her expression, no attempt to appear demure or feminine. This was a woman who'd fought for every inch of ground she stood on, and her face showed the cost of that battle. Hard-won wisdom mixed with a deep, bone-deep exhaustion. She looks Wendermud, Rose observed, standing at Margaret's elbow. Even though she's rich and has this big house, she looks lonely. The girl was right. Beneath the strength and determination in Victoria's painted eyes, there was an unmistakable loneliness, the isolation of someone who'd achieved greatness in a world that didn't want her to succeed. Being different is lonely, Margaret said quietly, thinking of her own isolation in Copper Ridge, how the other miners' wives had never quite accepted her because she'd had more education than most, because she'd sometimes helped Robert with calculations and planning when the company supervisors weren't looking. Being the first to do something, being the only one, means there's no one else who understands what you've been through. The desk drawers yielded more treasures, technical journals filled with Victoria's neat handwriting, documenting experiments with ore processing and hydraulic pressure, financial records showing profits that would make modern mine operators weep with envy. And tucked in the bottom drawer, wrapped in oilcloth, protected from moisture and time, was another letter addressed in the same elegant script as the one in the inheritance envelope. To whoever inherits my life's work. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal and unfolded the pages. The paper was thick, expensive, and the ink had held its color perfectly across 40 years. She read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper, while her children gathered close to listen. If you are reading this, then I am gone. Dead or disappeared, it matters little which. What matters is that you have come to the Ashford Estate in need, cast out by a world that has no use for widows and their children. I know this because I wrote my will specifically to ensure this property would pass to someone like you, someone like I was when I first came to Copper Ridge, with nothing but my mind and my stubbornness to sustain me. You are probably frightened. The house makes sounds that terrify those who don't understand. The locals have no doubt told you horrible stories about curses, witchcraft, and divine punishment. Let me ease your fears with truth. There are no ghosts here, no supernatural forces, no deals with the devil. What lies beneath your feet is simply engineering, advanced engineering that most people in 1912 cannot comprehend, and probably it still cannot comprehend when you read this, however many years hence. The sound you hear, that steady mechanical heartbeat, comes from a hydraulic system I designed to process copper ore more efficiently than any method previously known. The system uses the underground streams that flow beneath this mountain, channeling their force through a series of pumps and pistons that operate continuously, requiring no coal or human labor to function. It is, in essence, a perpetual motion machine. Not truly perpetual, as it requires water pressure to operate, but self-sustaining as long as the streams flow. I built it in secret, deep beneath the house, because I knew that if I revealed such technology openly, it would be stolen. A woman's innovations are never credited as her own. They are taken, repackaged, and attributed to the men who steal them. So I kept my greatest achievement hidden, using it to process ore from my mines and tunnels that connected to the basement levels of this house. The copper that made my fortune was refined here, beneath where you now stand, using methods that the mining companies of Montana would kill to possess. And that, dear inheritor, is why I had to disappear. I won't burden you with the full story, the threats, the attempts on my life, the realization that my very existence had become untenable. Suffice to say that staying meant death, and leaving meant allowing my life's work to fall into the hands of men who would use it without understanding it, who would break what they couldn't comprehend. So I chose a third option. I vanished, leaving everything in legal limbo, trusting that the law would eventually deliver my legacy to someone who needed it more than the vultures who circled while I lived. Now, practical matters. The padlock on the basement door, the new one you've no doubt discovered, was not placed by me. I locked that door with an old iron lock when I left, hiding the key in a place I'll describe shortly. Someone else has been here in the years since. Someone who wants to keep you from the basement and what it contains. I suspect I know who, but I won't name names across the years. Suffice to say, you have enemies you don't yet know about. People who will not want you to claim your inheritance fully. The key to the original lock, which will open the inner door once you've dealt with the padlock, is hidden in the library, behind the third bookshelf from the left. At floor level, you'll find a loose board. Pry it up and you'll discover a small compartment containing the key and other items I've left for for you. Money mostly in gold coins that won't depreciate over time. It should be enough to see you through several winters, enough to give you independence. But the real treasure, the real inheritance, is the knowledge in the basement, the machines I built, the systems I designed, the innovations I achieved. These are worth more than gold if you have the courage to claim them and the intelligence to understand them. I believe you do, or you wouldn't have survived long enough to reach this house. One warning, the hydraulic system is delicate. It has been running unmaintained for however many years since I left. And while I designed it to be self-correcting within limits, there may be wear that needs attention. Do not, I repeat, do not attempt to shut down the system entirely. The pressure built up over years of continuous operation could cause catastrophic failure if released improperly. When you descend to the basement, you must understand the mechanics before you touch anything. I've left detailed diagrams and instructions in a safe room below. Study them carefully. Your life and the lives of your children depend on you not making mistakes with machinery you don't fully understand. I wish I could be there to guide you, to show you in person what I've built and how it works, but I couldn't stay, and I couldn't risk taking the knowledge with me where it might be tortured or coerced from. So I've left it here, sleeping in the mountain, waiting for someone worthy to wake it and use it properly. You are that person. I know this with certainty because if you weren't, you would have fled by now. The fact that you are reading this letter means you've stayed despite your fear, which means you have the strength to do what needs to be done. Be brave, be careful, be smarter than the men who think women can't understand machines, and know that somewhere in whatever realm I've fled to or passed on to, I'm watching and hoping for your success. With great faith in your courage, Victoria Ashford, the Copper Queen, October 15, 1912. Margaret finished reading and sat back in Victoria's chair, her mind reeling. The letter answered so many questions and raised dozens more. The machinery below wasn't malevolent, it was extraordinary. A perpetual hydraulic system running on natural water pressure, processing ore without human labor. In 1952, with modern engineering knowledge, such a system would be considered revolutionary. In 1912, it would have been considered impossible. No wonder Victoria had enemies. No wonder she'd vanished rather than let her innovations fall into grasping hands. Does that mean we're rich? Jacob asked, his young mind fastening on the most immediate practical detail. She said there's gold in the library. It means we have options, Margaret corrected gently, though her own heart was beating faster at the thought of gold coins hidden beneath a floorboard, enough to see them through several winters. It means we can survive here if we're smart and careful. But someone put a new lock on the door, Rose pointed out, her 14-year-old mind already working through the implications. Victoria said she didn't do that. So who did and why? That was the question that worried Margaret most. Someone had been in this house since Victoria left. Someone had wanted to keep future occupants away from the basement. The most likely candidate was obvious, Brennan Copper, or specifically the Brennan family who owned the company. They would have known about Victoria's innovations, would have coveted her methods, would have been frustrated when her disappearance put the estate in legal limbo where they couldn't touch it. And now Margaret, a Brennan widow, had inherited it all, which meant the Brennan family, which meant Howard specifically, would not be pleased when they discovered she claimed the estate. They would want this property, would want whatever was in the basement, would want to stop her from accessing Victoria's legacy. We need to move fast, Margaret said, standing abruptly. Rose, Jacob, come with me to the library. We need to find that key and the gold of Victoria left. Peter, you're in charge of the little one. Keep them in the kitchen, keep the fire going. Don't let anyone go outside. If you hear anything strange, anyone approaching the house, you come get me immediately. Understood? Peter nodded solemnly, puffing up slightly at being given responsibility. Margaret grabbed one of the oil lamps and led Rose and Jacob through the silent house to the library, her mind already racing ahead to all the things that needed to be done. The third bookshelf from the left was easy to identify, and at floor level, Margaret found the loose board exactly where Victoria had described. It took some work with a letter opener from the desk to pry it up, but when it finally came free, the compartment beneath was revealed. A small space, perhaps 8 inches square, carefully lined with metal to protect against moisture. Inside was a leather pouch, heavy with coins. Margaret opened it with shaking hands and poured the contents into her palm. Gold eagle and double eagle, dozens of them, each one representing $20 in spending power. She did quick mental math and felt her knees go weak. There had to be at least $500 in gold per year, maybe more, a year. A fortune. Enough to buy food and supplies for years. Enough to hire help if needed. Enough to give her children a real future. Next to the pouch was the key, an ornate iron key much like the one that had opened the front door, but smaller, designed for an interior lock. And beneath that was one more item, a small leather-bound journal, much thinner than the technical volumes in the study. Margaret opened it to the first page and found Victoria's handwriting again, but less formal this time, more personal. These are my private thoughts, written not for posterity, but for myself, to process what I've learned and experienced. If someone else reads them someday, so be it. Perhaps my mistakes can teach lessons I didn't live long enough to apply. The greatest mistake a woman can make is believing that proving herself in a man's world will earn their respect. It won't. It will only earn their resentment and their determination to destroy what they cannot control. control. I learned this too late. I thought if I were brilliant enough, successful enough, undeniable enough, they would have to accept me as an equal. Instead, they saw me as a threat to be eliminated. The second greatest mistake is isolating yourself in the pursuit of excellence. I built walls around myself, both literal and figurative. I told myself I didn't need friends, didn't need companionship, didn't need anything but my work. And now, at the end, I realize that work without human connection is just elaborate suicide. I've spent 20 years in this house, building wonders that no one will ever see, achieving greatness that no one will celebrate, and I am utterly, crushingly alone. If you're reading this because you have inherited my estate, learn from my failure. Use what I've built, yes. Claim the wealth I've left you, absolutely. But don't make the mistake I made. Don't isolate yourself. Don't let pride keep you from asking for help. Don't sacrifice every human connection on the altar of independence. Strength doesn't mean doing everything alone. It means knowing when to be alone and when to reach for others. I never learned that lesson. Maybe you can. Margaret closed the journal, feeling an unexpected kinship with this woman she'd never met. Victoria had been so strong, so brilliant, so far ahead of her time, and so deeply lonely that it bled through every word she wrote. Margaret understood that loneliness, felt it in her own bones, the isolation of being a woman trying to survive in a world designed to keep her dependent and powerless. But Victoria was right about one thing. Isolation was a trap, not a triumph. Margaret had 7 children who needed her to be strong, but also needed her to be human, to show them that asking for help wasn't weakness. When the time came, and it would come, to deal with Howard and Brennan Copper, Margaret wouldn't face them alone. She'd find allies, build connections, use the tools Victoria had left her, not just to survive, but to build something better. Mama, look at this. Rose's voice pulled Margaret from her thought. Her daughter was standing by the window, pointing outside toward the driveway that wound down the mountain. And there, visible through the falling snow, was a figure on horseback, climbing slowly toward the house. Margaret's heart clenched. Already? Someone was coming already? They'd only been here one night, and already their refuge was being invaded? She moved to the window, squinting through the snow to make out details. The rider was bundled in a heavy coat, but as they drew closer, Margaret could see it wasn't Howard or one of his thugs. It was a woman, elderly, riding with the careful posture of someone whose bones ached in the cold. Stay here, Margaret told the children. She tucked the pouch of gold into her pocket, grabbed the iron key, and went to the front door. She opened it just as the woman dismounted, moving stiffly, and turned to face the house. The visitor was perhaps 70, with a face like a dried apple and eyes that held surprising sharpness. She studied Margaret for a long moment, then smiled slightly. So, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the falling snow, someone finally came. Victoria said someone would eventually clearly. Said her house would find the right person when the time was right. She paused. I'm Ellen McKenna. I was Victoria's housekeeper, back before she left, and I've been waiting 40 years to give someone the message she left for me to deliver. Margaret stared, her mind struggling to process this new development. A housekeeper, a message, another piece of Victoria's carefully laid plan falling into place across 4 decades. What message? Margaret asked. Ellen smiled more broadly. That whoever inherited the house would need a friend, someone who understands what Victoria built and how it works, someone who can stand between you and the men who will try to take it from you. She gestured toward the house. May I come in? I'm too old to have this conversation in a snowstorm. And besides, we have a lot to discuss before Howard Brennan figures out you're here and sends his dogs to chase you off. Margaret stepped back from the door, holding it open in invitation. For the first time since Robert died, since the world fell apart around her, Margaret felt something that might have been hope stirring in her chest. She wasn't alone anymore. Victoria had seen to that too, reaching across time to offer not just gold and machines and knowledge, but the thing Margaret needed most, an ally. The Copper Queen was still protecting her legacy, even from beyond whatever grave or refuge she'd found. And Margaret was beginning to understand that she hadn't just inherited a house, she'd inherited a revolution. Ellen McKenna sat at Victoria's old desk as if she'd never left, her gnarled hands wrapped around a cup of tea that Margaret had brewed from supplies the old woman had brought in her saddlebag. The children watched from the doorway, curious but cautious, as this stranger who claimed to know the Copper Queen began to speak. I was 28 when Victoria hired me, Ellen said, her voice steady despite her age, young and stupid enough to believe the stories about her being a witch. But I needed work. My husband had died in the very same mine that took your Robert, Mrs. Brennan, crushed in a collapse that the company called unavoidable, even though 3 engineers had warned them the supports were inadequate. Sound familiar? Margaret nodded slowly, recognizing her own story in Ellen's words. The pattern of the Brennan family repeating itself across generations, grinding up lives, calling it progress. Victoria took me in when no one else would hire a widow, Ellen continued. She paid me 3 times what any other household in Copper Ridge offered, gave me my own room, treated me like a colleague rather than a servant, and in return, I kept her secret. God knows she had plenty of. Ellen took a long sip of tea, her eyes going distant with memory. The house was alive back then, truly alive. The basement machines ran day and night, processing ore that was brought up through tunnels that connected to her mines. You could feel it through your feet wherever you stood, that constant rhythm, like the house was breathing. Victoria would spend days down, emerging covered in copper dust and grease, her eyes bright with whatever new innovation she'd perfected. She was, Ellen paused, searching for words. She was like a force of nature, Miss Brennan. Like a storm you couldn't stop, couldn't control, could only marvel at from a distance. What happened to her? Rose asked from the doorway, unable to contain her curiosity. The letter said she disappeared, but why? What was she running from? Ellen's expression hard. From them, the Brennan family specifically. Oh, they weren't called Brennan Copper back then. It was Northern Montana Mining Company, owned by the Brennan grandfather, Silas. He'd been trying to buy Victoria out for years, making offers that got progressively less friendly. When she kept refusing, he started a campaign to destroy her reputation, spread rumors about witchcraft, about improper relations with her workers, about instability and madness. Classic tactics used against women who won't submit. Margaret felt anger kindle in her chest, a slow-burning fury at the predictability of it all. Different generation, same method. Destroy what can't control. But Victoria was too smart, too well protected legally, Ellen went on. Her mines were the most profitable in Montana. Her methods revolutionary, even if no one understood how she achieved her results. Silas couldn't touch her through conventional means, so he tried something else. Ellen's voice dropped. He tried to have her killed. The room went very quiet. Even the steady tump, tump, tump from below seemed to soften, as if the house itself was listening. It was October of 1912, Ellen said. I was here in this very house when Victoria came running in from the mine. She was bleeding. Someone had shot at her, grazed her shoulder. She'd been inspecting one of the tunnels when two men, hired guns, ambushed her. She only escaped because she knew those tunnels better than anyone alive. She came through the basement entrance, locked everything behind her, and I helped her clean and bandage the wound. Ellen's hands tightened on her teacup. That night, she made her decision. She couldn't stay. Silas Brennan had made it clear that if he couldn't have her innovations, no one would. He'd kill her and claim the mines were too dangerous to operate, seize them through legal manipulation. So Victoria chose to vanish instead. She spent 3 days preparing, writing letters, hiding money, setting legal traps that would keep the estate in limbo for decades. And then she left. Where did she go? Margaret asked. She never told me, Ellen admitted. Said it was safer if I didn't know. That way I couldn't be forced to reveal it. She just left. Walked out one morning with a single bag, headed south toward the railroad, and vanished into the world. I stayed here for another month, maintaining the house as if she might return. Then the lawyers came with the will, and I realized she'd planned never to come back. And the padlock on the basement door? Margaret asked, remembering Victoria's letter and the newer lock that someone had added. Victoria said that wasn't her doing. Ellen's face darkened with something that looked like shame. That was me, or rather, that was something I did under duress about 15 years ago. Howard Brennan, Silas's grandson, the man who threw you out, came to me. By then I was living in town, working when I could, getting by. He said he knew I'd worked for Victoria, knew I had access to the house. He wanted me to open the basement, let him see the machines, document everything, and if I didn't, she swallowed hard. He threatened to reveal that I'd been stealing from the estate. A lie, of course, but one a judge might believe. A widow's word against a Brennan's? I had no chance. So you let him in, Margaret said, not judging, just stating fact. I let him into the house, Ellen corrected, but I didn't let him into the basement. Victoria had given me the key to the front door, but never the basement key. She said that was for whoever inherited the property, not for me. So I told Howard I'd lost it years ago. He was furious, tore apart half the house looking for it. When he couldn't find it, he put his own padlock on the door, said he'd deal with it properly later. I think he's been waiting all these years for the legal wrangling to resolve, for the estate to pass to someone he could intimidate or buy off. He didn't expect a widow who'd lost everything and had nothing left to lose, Margaret said quietly. No, Ellen agreed, a small smile touching her lined face. I don't think he did, and that's his mistake. Victoria knew. She knew that the person who'd inherit this place would be someone desperate enough to stay, strong enough to fight, and smart enough to understand what she'd built. She was betting on you, Mrs. Brennan, long before you were born. The weight of that statement settled over Margaret like a mantle. Victoria Ashford, dead or disappeared for 40 years, had seen her come, had arranged events, written will, left letters and gold and keys, all calibrated to deliver this estate into the hands of someone who'd need it badly enough to defend it. The basement, Margaret said, pulling Victoria's key from her pocket and setting it on the desk. We need to get down there, not just because Victoria said there's knowledge and equipment worth having, but because I need to understand what I'm defending. Howard will come. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. And when he does, I need to know what this house is worth, what I'm really protecting. Ellen nodded slowly. You're right, but there's something you should know before we go down. The hydraulic system, it's not just machinery, it's dangerous. Victoria knew what she was doing, understood the pressures and tolerances, knew how to maintain it, but it's been running unmaintained for 40 years. There could be weaknesses, pressure buildups, places where the metal has worn thin. If something breaks while you're down there, if the pressure releases wrong, she didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. The implication was clear. Catastrophic failure, possibly fatal. Then we'll be careful, Margaret said firm, but we're going down. I need to see it. She gathered her children, giving them clear instructions. Rose would stay upstairs with the younger one, keeping them in the kitchen where it was warm, maintaining containing the fire, keeping watch at the windows for anyone approaching. Ellen would accompany Margaret into the basement, both because the old woman knew more about Victoria's work than anyone else alive, and because if something went wrong, someone needed to be there to get help. The padlock on the basement door took 10 minutes and a heavy iron poker from the fireplace to break. The lock was good quality, but the hasp it was attached to was mounted in old wood that had dried and weakened over decades. When it finally gave way with a crack like a gunshot, the door swung open, revealing another door behind it, the original one Victoria had installed, with a keyhole that matched the iron key Margaret held. The key turned smoothly, as if the lock had been oiled yesterday rather than 40 years ago. The door opened outward, and a smell wafted up from below that made Margaret's nose wrinkle. Not the rotten decay she'd expected, but the scent of machine oil and metal and moving water, a clean industrial smell that suggested the machinery below was indeed still functioning, and the sound, which had been muffled by two doors, now hit them with full force. Tump, 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 much louder now, joined by other sounds. The rush of water through pipes, the whir of gears, the occasional hiss of hydraulic pressure being released and rebuilt. It was deafening, overwhelming, the symphony of a factory operating at full capacity despite being abandoned for decades. Ellen lit a lantern and led the way down steep stone steps that descended into darkness. Margaret followed, her heart pounding harder than the machinery, her mouth dry with fear and anticipation in equal measure. The stairs seemed to go down forever, cut directly into the bedrock beneath the house. The walls wept with condensation, and the temperature dropped with each step until Margaret could see her breath fogging in the lamplight. The sound grew louder, more complex, revealing layers of mechanical operation that she hadn't been able to distinguish from above. And then they reached the bottom, and Margaret stopped breathing altogether. The basement wasn't a basement, it was a cathedral of engineering, a vast underground chamber carved from living rock and filled with machinery that looked like nothing Margaret had ever seen. Massive copper pipes, some as thick as tree trunks, ran along the walls and ceiling, forming a network that seemed to have no beginning or end. Huge iron wheels turned slowly, their teeth meshing with gear systems of incredible complexity, and everywhere water, flowing through clear tube, driving piston, turning wheel, the lifeblood of the entire system. But the centerpiece, the thing that made Margaret's engineer-minded brain struggle to comprehend what she was seeing, was the main hydraulic press. It dominated the center of the chamber, a massive iron structure, perhaps 20 feet tall, with arms that rose and fell with that steady tump, 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 crushing ore in a grinding chamber that fed into a series of separation channels, where the copper was extracted from waste rock through a process Margaret couldn't immediately understand. My God, Margaret breathed. It's still working. After 40 years, it's still processing ore. No, Ellen corrected gently. It's running, but it's not processing anymore. The ore supply was cut off when Victoria left. What you're hearing, what it's doing, is running empty cycle. The hydraulic pressure from the underground streams has to go somewhere. Victoria designed the system so that if ore wasn't being fed in, the press would simply compress air instead of rock, maintaining the pressure balance so nothing explodes. It's been doing that for 40 years, waiting for someone to feed it again. Margaret moved closer, holding the lantern high, studying the press with an intensity that blocked out everything else. She'd helped Robert with mining calculations, had learned basic engineering principles from books she'd borrowed from the company library. She understood enough to recognize genius when she saw it, and this was genius of the highest order. The hydraulic system used natural water pressure from mountain streams that Victoria had tapped deep underground. That pressure was channeled through a series of valves and cylinders that amplified and focused it, creating enough force to crush rock while requiring no fuel, no human labor, no external power source. The water that drove the system was then diverted into a drainage system that carried it away, allowing the streams to flow unimpeded while harvesting their power. It was perpetual motion in the truest sense, not actually perpetual, as it required the streams to keep flowing, but self-sustaining, requiring no input except water that nature provided freely. This shouldn't be possible, Margaret said more to herself than to Ellen. The pressure tolerances, the seals, the wear on the moving parts, conventional hydraulics fail within months without maintenance. This has been running for 40 years. Victoria was 40 years ahead of her time, Ellen said simply. Maybe more. She understood things about pressure and flow that the best engineers in the world are only beginning to grasp. And she built this not to prove she could, but because it was the only way she could operate independently. Every other mine in Montana required constant fuel shipments, constant maintenance, constant oversight from company supervisors. Victoria's mines ran themselves, processing ore automatically, making her wealthy without making her dependent on anyone. Margaret understood the brilliance of it, the revolutionary nature of what she was seeing. This wasn't just advanced engineering, it was a blueprint for independence, for a way of operating that freed you from the control system that kept most people trapped in dependence and debt. And if Howard Brennan ever understood what was down here, truly understood it, he'd kill to possess it. Not just for the wealth it could generate, but for the threat it represented to the entire system of corporate control that families like his had built empires on. Can it be restarted? Margaret asked. The ore processing, I mean. Can we actually use this? Ellen hesitated. Theoretically, yes. The machinery is sound. Victoria built things to last centuries, not decades. But you'd need ore to process, which means opening the mine tunnels that connect to this chamber. And those tunnels, she gestured to a section of wall where a heavy iron door stood closed. Those tunnels run directly into the mines that Howard Brennan now claims to own. Victoria's original mineral rights were never properly transferred. When she disappeared, everything went into legal limbo. But the Brennans have been extracting ore from those mountains for 40 years, and they'd argue they have claim through adverse possession. But this house, and the land it sits on, and the mineral rights that come with that land, those are mine now, Margaret said slowly, her legal mind working through the implications. Victoria's will was clear, which means any ore extracted from my mineral rights, even if it comes up through tunnels Howard thinks he owns, belongs to me. That's one interpretation, Ellen agreed, but it would take lawyers and courts to settle it. And in the meantime, the Brennans would do everything in their power to stop you from making that claim. Margaret was about to respond when a sound from above cut through the mechanical symphony. Rose's voice, high in fright, calling down the stairs. "Mama, someone's coming! Horses! Lots of them, coming up the mountain!" Margaret and Ellen exchanged a look, and in that moment, they both knew. Howard had found out. Somehow, he'd learned that Margaret had claimed the estate, and he was coming to do whatever it took to drive her out before she could discover what lay beneath her feet. But he was too late for that. She'd already seen Victoria's legacy, already understood what she was defending, and she'd be damned if she'd let Howard Brennan steal from another widow what had been rightfully left to her. "Come on," Margaret said, moving toward the stairs with sudden urgency. "We need to get back up there, lock this place down, prepare for whatever's coming." As they climbed back toward the world above, the hydraulic press continued its endless rhythm below. Tump, 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 the heart of the Copper Queen's revolution, still beating strong after 40 years, waiting for someone worthy to put it back to work. Margaret intended to be that person, but first, she had to survive whatever Howard Brennan was bringing to her door. Margaret burst through the basement door with Ellen close behind, her mind already racing through defensive strategies, even as her heart hammered with fear. Through the front windows, she could see them coming. 6 riders on horseback, moving with deliberate slowness up the snow-covered drive, their dark forms stark against the white landscape like ravens circling carrion. Howard Brennan rode at the front, his expensive coat and confident posture marking him as the leader. Behind him came 5 men Margaret didn't recognize, hired muscle, judging by their weathered faces and the rifles casually displayed across their saddle. Not company supervisors or foremen, but the kind of men you hired when you wanted someone frightened or hurt and didn't want to dirty your own hand. "Rose, get your brothers and sisters into the study," Margaret commanded, her voice sharp with urgency. "Close the door, push furniture against it. Don't come out no matter what you hear unless I call for you specific. Understood?" Rose's eyes were wide with fear, but she nodded and began herding the younger children away from the window. Margaret watched them go, feeling her heart tear between the need to protect them and the need to face what was coming. If she showed weakness now, if she let Howard drive her out, they'd all freeze in a ditch within a week. This was their only chance, their only shelter. She had to hold it. "There's a rifle," Ellen said quietly, moving to a cabinet in the corner of the entrance hall. She pulled out a Winchester that looked well-maintained despite its age. "Victoria kept it for hunting. I've been checking on it over the years, keeping it oiled. It's loaded." Margaret took the rifle, feeling its weight, its deadly potential. She'd never shot anyone, never even pointed a gun at a human being. The thought of doing so now made her stomach churn. But she'd also never been a widow with 7 children, facing down men who wanted to take her last refuge. Desperation, she was learning, could turn anyone into someone they'd never imagined being. The riders reached the front of the house and stopped, forming a semicircle that blocked the driveway. Howard dismounted with the easy confidence of a man who'd never questioned his right to take what he wanted. He was in his 40s, well-fed where most in Copper Ridge were lean, his face showing the comfortable cruelty of someone who'd inherited power rather than earned it. Margaret opened the front door but stayed behind it, keeping the threshold between her and the men outside. The rifle she held loosely, not pointed at anyone but visible, undeniable. "Margaret!" Howard called out, his voice carrying that false hardiness that men use when they're about to threaten you but want to seem reasonable. "Glad we caught you before you settled in. I know Emmett Walsh gave you those papers, but there's been a misunderstanding, a legal error. The Ashford Estate isn't available for inheritance after all. Turns out there were debts against it that have to be settled first." "That's a lie," Margaret said flatly. "The estate is free and clear. Victoria Ashford's will was specific, legally binding, and filed with the county. I have the deed properly transferred. This house is mine." Howard's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Now, Margaret, don't be difficult. You don't understand these legal matters. There are complications, claims against the property that have to be resolved. The responsible thing, the smart thing, would be to vacate until the courts sort it out. I'm sure we can find you and the children somewhere temporary in town." "No," Margaret interrupted. "We're staying. This is my property, legally inherited, and you're trespassing. I'm asking you once, politely, to leave." The false friendliness dropped from Howard's face like a mask removed. "You think you can hold this place? You think a widow with a bunch of brats can stand against Brennan Copper? Against me?" He gestured to the men behind him. "I've got legal right to inspect this property property for safety violations. That house has been abandoned for 40 years, probably full of structural hazards, fire risks. As a concerned citizen and a representative of the mining company that operates in this area, I have a duty to ensure it's habitable before anyone lives here. You have no such right. Ellen's voice came from behind Margaret, surprisingly strong for a woman her age. She stepped into view, and Margaret saw Howard's expression flicker with recognition and surprise. Ellen McKenna, I thought you were still alive, Howard, despite your grandfather's best efforts to work me to death in your company laundry. And I was Victoria Ashford's housekeeper for 15 years. I know exactly what legal protections she built into this property's deed. You want to inspect it? Get a court order, signed by a judge, not one of your paid lax. Until then, you're trespassing, and Montana law gives property owners the right to defend their land against trespassers. Margaret felt a surge of gratitude for Ellen's presence, for this elderly woman who was willing to stand beside her against men who could destroy them both with a word to the right authority. But she also saw the calculation in Howard's eyes, saw him weighing costs and benefits, deciding how far he could push before it became more expensive than it was worth. Tell you what, Margaret, Howard said, his voice dropping to something more dangerous, more honest. Let's stop playing games. You've been in the house one night. You've heard the sounds from below, the thumping, the machinery. You've probably figured out there's something valuable under there, and you're thinking maybe you can use it. Maybe you can claim whatever my grandfather couldn't get his hands on when Victoria disappeared. He took a step closer, and Margaret's hands tightened on the rifle. But here's what you don't know. That machinery is dangerous. Victoria was brilliant but unstable. Everyone said so. Whatever she built down there, it killed at least 3 workers before she sealed it off. The hydraulic pressure alone could blow this whole house off its foundation if something goes wrong. You want to gamble your children's lives on a 40-year-old death trap just to spite me? It was a good lie, Margaret had to admit. Plausible, calculated, terrifying. But Ellen's sharp intake of breath told her it was indeed a lie. Victoria's machinery had never killed anyone. That was just another story the Brennan family had spread to justify their own coveting of her innovations. If it's so dangerous, Margaret said evenly, then why are you so eager to get inside? Why has this house stood empty for 40 years while you waited for legal access? If you really believed it was a death trap, you'd be happy to let me take the risk. Howard's jaw tight. I'm trying to save your life, you stupid woman. But if you want to be stubborn about it, fine. You've got until tomorrow morning to get out. After that, I'll get a court order declaring the house unfit for habitation, and I'll have the sheriff escort you and your brats off the property. You can fight it in court if you want, but where will you stay while the legal process drags on for months? Where will you go when winter really sets in? It was a good threat because it was true. Margaret had no other resources, no fallback position. If Howard could get a judge, and in Copper Ridge, with Brennan money and influence, he almost certainly could, to declare the house unsafe, she'd be back where she started, homeless, desperate, with nowhere to go. Unless she could prove that she had legal standing he couldn't challenge, resources he didn't know about, allies who could counter his influence. You'll have my answer tomorrow morning, Margaret said, her voice steady despite the fear crawling up her spine. Until then, you're trespassing. Leave now. For a long moment, Howard stared at her, clearly trying to decide if she'd actually shoot. Margaret kept the rifle steady, her finger near but not on the trigger, her eyes locked on his. She projected a confidence she didn't entirely feel, channeling every bit of Victoria Ashford's stubborn strength that seemed to linger in the very walls of the house. Finally, Howard turned and mounted his horse. Tomorrow morning, Margaret, don't make this harder than it needs to be. He wheeled his horse around and led his men back down the mountain, their forms gradually disappearing into the falling snow. Margaret waited until they were completely out of sight before she lowered the rifle, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. Ellen took it from her gently and set it aside, then pulled Margaret into a brief, fierce hug. You did well, Ellen said. Victoria would have been proud. He's coming back, Margaret said, her voice hollow. Tomorrow or the next day, with papers and the sheriff and men with guns. And we don't have anything to fight him with, except words on documents he'll find a way around. Maybe we do, Ellen said slowly, a calculating look entering her eye. Maybe Victoria left us more than machinery and gold. Come with me. There's something else in the basement I didn't show you. Something I think we're going to need. They went back down into the mechanical cathedral, this time without the urgency of discovery, but with the focused purpose of desperate people looking for weapons. Ellen led Margaret past the main hydraulic press to the far wall where another door stood, smaller and more concealed than the main entrance. Victoria's private workshop, Ellen explained as she opened the door with a key Margaret hadn't seen before. This is where she did her experimental work, kept her most sensitive documents. I never came in here without her permission, but she told me once that if she ever disappeared and if someone worthy inherited the estate, I should show them this room. She said it contained ammunition for the battles that would come. The workshop was smaller than the main chamber, but no less impressive. Workbenches lined the walls, covered with tools and equipment that Margaret couldn't immediately identify. But it was the filing cabinets against the back wall that Ellen headed for, pulling open drawer after drawer until she found what she was looking for, a thick folder marked with red wax, insurance. Inside were documents that made Margaret's breath catch. Survey maps showing not just Victoria's original mineral claims, but every copper deposit deposit in the entire Copper Ridge area, including ones that the Brennan family supposedly discovered in 1915 and 1923. Correspondence between Silas Brennan and various officials, including several letters that strongly suggested bribery and fraud in mining claims. Financial records showing that the Brennan Copper Company's most profitable mines were actually on land that Victoria had surveyed and documented first. But the most damning piece was a notarized statement dated October 10, 1912, just days before Victoria disappeared. In it, she detailed threats against her life, specific conversations with Silas Brennan, where he'd promised to solve the Victoria problem one way or another. She named witnesses, provided dates, created a paper trail that any honest investigator would have to take serious. She knew, Margaret breathed, shuffling through the papers with growing amazement. She knew she was going to have to disappear, so she created leverage, evidence that would destroy the Brennan family if it ever came to light. She couldn't use it herself without putting herself in more danger, but she left it for whoever came after. For you, Ellen corrected. She left it for you, because she knew, somehow she knew, that the Brennans would keep doing what they'd always done, that eventually they'd push too far against the wrong person, and that person would need weapons to fight back. Margaret looked at the document, her mind racing through possibilities. This was explosive material, evidence of fraud and corruption that went back decades. If she brought this to the right authorities, not the local sheriff who was in Brennan's pocket, but state officials, maybe even federal mining regulators, it could open investigations that would tear apart the Brennan Copper Company's claims to half their mining operation. But it was also dangerous, the kind of dangerous that got people killed. The Brennans had tried to murder Victoria to keep her quiet. They'd let Robert die in unsafe mines rather than spend money on proper supports. They wouldn't hesitate to eliminate a widow who threatened their empire with evidence of their crime, unless she made the evidence public, made it impossible to suppress even if something happened to her. We need to get copies of these to someone safe, Margaret said, her plan forming even as she spoke. Multiple copies sent to different places, state mining commission, federal authorities, newspapers in other cities. We need to make sure that if Howard comes after us, the evidence survives, even if we don't. That will take time, Ellen warned. Copying all these documents, finding trustworthy people to send them to, getting them mailed without Howard's people intercepting them. We might have days before he comes back with his court order. Then we work fast, Margaret said firmly. She looked around the workshop at the evidence of Victoria's genius, at the tools and machines this woman had built to free herself from male control. Victoria fought alone for 20 years and finally had to run. But I'm not alone. I have you. I have these documents. And somewhere out there have to be other people who are tired of the Brennan family's stranglehold in this region. We just need to find them. Give them a reason to stand with us. You're talking about starting a war, Ellen said quietly. A legal war, maybe, but still a war. The Brennans won't just let you expose them. They'll fight dirty, attack every way they can think of. They already started the war, Margaret countered, when they killed Robert with their negligence, when they threw me and my children out into the cold, when they tried to murder Victoria and steal what she'd built. I'm not starting anything. I'm just finally fighting back. She gathered the documents carefully, her hands steady now, despite the magnitude of what she was planning. This wasn't just about keeping a house anymore. This was about justice for Robert, for Victoria, for every worker who died in Brennan Mine, for every widow who'd been cast aside as inconvenient. This was about making sure that men like Howard Brennan couldn't just keep crushing people and expecting no consequence. We'll need help, Margaret said, thinking out loud. Legal help first. Is there anyone in Montana who'd take on a case against Brennan Copper? Ellen thought for a moment, then nodded slowly. There's a lawyer in Helena, name of Sarah Chen. Chinese woman, brilliant legal mind, takes cases no one else will touch. She's represented miners against companies before, won a few times. The Brennans hate her, which means she might be very interested in seeing evidence that could bring them down. Then we contact her, Margaret decided. Tonight, can you get to town? Send a telegram? I can, Ellen confirmed, but you'll be alone here until I get back, maybe overnight. If Howard comes back while I'm gone, I'll deal with it, Margaret said, with more confidence than she felt. I've got Victoria's rifle and 7 children counting on me. That's more than enough motivation to hold this house. They worked quickly, carefully separating out the most damning documents to be copied and sent. Ellen left on horseback as evening fell, carrying letters and instructions and the heavy responsibility of starting a legal battle that could reshape Copper Ridge's entire power structure. Margaret locked the door behind her and gathered her children from the study where they'd been hiding. They ate a simple meal of preserved food from Victoria's pantry, and Margaret told them what was happening, what was coming, what they were fighting for. We're not just defending this house, she told them, looking at each of her 7 children in turn. We're defending the principle that people like us, people without power, without money, without men to protect us, still have rights, that widows and children matter, that women like Victoria Ashford, who build amazing things, deserve to have their work recognized and honored, not stolen. Rose, her eldest, understood. Margaret could see it in her eyes, the way they hardened with determination. What do you need us to do? Be brave, Margaret said simply. Whatever happens tomorrow when Howard comes back, you stay calm, you stay strong, and you remember that we have right on our side. That counts for something. Maybe not enough by itself, but something. That night, as the children children slept and the house groaned around her, Margaret descended one more time into the basement. She stood before the massive hydraulic press, watching it work through its endless cycle. Tump, 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 Victoria's heart still beating strong. "I won't let them take this," Margaret whispered to the empty chamber, to Victoria's ghost if it was listening. "I won't let them steal from you a second time, I promise." The machinery didn't answer, but its rhythm seemed to steady, to synchronize with Margaret's own heartbeat, as if the house was acknowledging her vow, accepting her as its new defender. Tomorrow would bring Howard and his threats, his court orders, his attempts to drive her out. But tonight she had Victoria's legacy to protect her. Documents that could destroy the Brennan family, machinery that could change the future, and a determination forged in loss and desperation and the absolute refusal to be a victim one more time. The Copper Queen had left her a kingdom, and Margaret intended to claim every inch of it. Dawn came cold and gray to the Ashford Estate, the kind of November morning where the sun seemed reluctant to rise, as if it knew what darkness the day would bring. Margaret stood at the front window, watching the road down the mountain, a cup of bitter coffee warming her hands. She hadn't slept, couldn't sleep, her mind too busy running through scenarios and strategies for the confrontation she knew was coming. Ellen had returned just before midnight, exhausted from the hard ride to town and back, but bearing good news. Sarah Chen, the lawyer, and Helena had responded immediately to Ellen's telegram. More than that, she was already on a train heading to Copper Ridge, along with a federal mining inspector she'd contacted, a man named William Torres, who'd been looking for an excuse to investigate Brennan Copper's operations for years. "They'll be here by this afternoon," Ellen had reported, her old eyes bright with something that looked like hope. Sarah said if even half of what's in those documents is true, she can bury the Brennan family in litigation for the next decade. And Torres, he said there have been complaints about safety violations at Brennan mines for years, but the local authorities always blocked his investigations. This could be the opening he needed. That was the good news. The bad news was that afternoon was hours away, and Howard Brennan was already on his way up the mountain. Margaret saw them coming just after 8 in the morning, a larger group this time, at least a dozen men on horseback, led by Howard and accompanied by a portly man in a sheriff's badge, who rode with the uncomfortable posture of someone more used to sitting in an office than on a horse. "Here we go," Margaret murmured, checking the rifle one more time. She'd spent the night practicing how to hold it, how to aim, trying to convince herself she could actually pull the trigger if it came to that. She still wasn't sure, but she was determined not to let them see her uncertainty. The children were in the study again, with Rose given strict instructions. If shooting started, they were to go out the back door and run into the woods, following the stream downhill until they reached the town. Ellen had given Rose money in the name of a boarding house owner who could be trusted. It was a plan born of desperation, a last resort if everything went wrong, but at least it was a plan. The riders assembled in front of the house, a show of force designed to intimidate. Howard dismounted with the same confident swagger as yesterday, but this time the sheriff came with him, huffing as he climbed down from his horse. "Mrs. Brennan," Howard called out, not bothering with false pleasantries this time. "This is Sheriff Dalton. He has a court order declaring this property unsafe for habitation. You and your children need to vacate immediately." Margaret opened the door but stayed on her side of the threshold, the rifle held loosely but visibly. "Show me the order." The sheriff pulled a document from his coat pocket and held it up, though he didn't approach close enough for Margaret to actually read it. "Signed by Judge Morrison this morning, the Ashford Estate is declared structurally unsound and potentially dangerous due to unmaintained machinery. All occupants must vacate until a proper safety inspection can be conducted." "Judge Morris," Margaret said flatly, "who happens to be Howard Brennan's brother-in-law. How convenient." "The relationship is irrelevant," the sheriff blustered, his face reddening. "The order is legal and binding. Now, I don't want any trouble here, Mrs. Brennan. I know you've had a hard time losing your husband and all, but you can't stay in this house. It's for your own safety and your children's safety." "Let me see the actual order," Margaret insisted. "Bring it here. Let me read it properly. I have a right to understand what I'm being accused of, or what my property is being accused of." The sheriff exchanged a glance with Howard, clearly uncertain. Finally, he started forward, the paper held out before him like a peace offering. That's when Ellen emerged from the house, stepping around Margaret with a thick folder of documents in her hand. "Before you serve that order, Sheriff, you might want to see these," Ellen said, her voice carrying clearly across the cold morning air. "They're surveys and claim documents from 1899 through 1912, all notarized and legally filed, showing that Victoria Ashford discovered and properly claimed the 3 richest copper deposits in this region, including the ones that Brennan Copper has been mining for the last 40 years. Howard's face went pale, then flushed dark red. "Those are forgeries! Lies made up by a crazy woman. They're authenticated by the original county clerk, properly witnessed, and backed by geological surveys that any modern inspector can verify." Ellen continued calmly, pulling out document after document and holding them up for everyone to see. "They prove that Brennan Copper has been extracting ore from land they never legally owned, and land that belonged to Victoria Ashford and now belongs to Margaret Brennan. You can't prove," Howard started, but Ellen cut him off. "We can prove all of it, and we've already sent copies to the Montana State Mining Commission, the Federal Bureau of Mines, and a lawyer lawyer in Helena who specializes in mineral rights cases. They should be receiving those documents this morning, along with correspondence showing that your grandfather, Silas Brennan, threatened Victoria Ashford's life when she refused to sell him her claim. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the horses seemed to sense the shift in the air, stamping nervously, their breath fogging in the cold. Howard's face had gone from red to a dangerous shade of purple. "You stupid, stupid woman," he said, his voice low in venom. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You've just declared war on the most powerful family in Montana. We'll destroy you. We'll bury you in legal fees until you're begging in the streets. We'll make sure you never work, never eat, never. You'll do nothing," came a new voice from behind the assembled rider. Everyone turned to see two more riders approaching, a striking Chinese woman in an impeccable suit despite the cold, and a stern-looking man with a federal badge visible on his coat. Sarah Chen and William Torres arrived hours earlier than expected. Sarah dismounted with practiced ease and walked directly past Howard and the sheriff as if they were invisible, her attention focused entirely on Margaret. "Mrs. Margaret Brennan, I'm Sarah Chen, attorney at law. You sent me documents concerning mineral rights fraud. I've reviewed them and I believe you have an exceptionally strong case. I'd like to represent you, if you'll have me." Margaret felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she'd been holding for so long she'd forgotten it was there. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll have you." Sarah turned to face Howard, her expression pleasant, but her eyes sharp as knives. "Mr. Brennan, I'm here to inform you that as of this moment, all mining operations on land claimed by my client must cease immediately. Continued extraction of ore from disputed land will be considered theft and prosecuted accordingly." "This is insane," Howard exploded. "Those mines employ 300 men. You can't just shut them down based on some papers a widow dragged out of an attic." "I can't," Sarah agreed, "but Mr. Torres can. He's a federal mining inspector with the authority to shut down any operation where there are questions about legal ownership or safety violations. And based on the documents Mrs. Brennan has provided, there are significant questions about both." William Torres stepped forward, his face showing no emotion. "Mr. Brennan, I'm hereby serving notice that all Brennan Copper operations are under federal investigation for mineral rights fraud, safety violations, and conspiracy to commit fraud in the claiming of federal land. Your mines are closed, effective immediately, pending resolution of these investigations." "You can't." "This is," Howard sputtered, looking wildly between the federal inspector, the lawyer, and Margaret, as if he couldn't quite believe what was happening. "Sheriff, arrest these people. They're trespassing, interfering with legal business operations." "I'd be very careful about giving that order," Sarah said quietly to the sheriff, "because if you arrest a federal official in the performance of his duties, you'll be looking at federal charge. And if you attempt to enforce that questionable court order against Mrs. Brennan when there are now documented questions about property ownership, you'll be party to an illegal eviction. Your brother-in-law judge might protect you locally, but he can't protect you from federal prosecution." Sheriff Dalton looked at the court order in his hands as if it had transformed into a snake. Slowly, carefully, he began backing toward his horse. I think there might be some procedural issues with this order. Might need to get it reviewed by a different judge, maybe." He mounted quickly and rode away without looking back, leaving Howard standing alone with his hired men, who were also starting to look uncertain about exactly who they were working for and what kind of trouble they might be getting into. Howard's face had gone from purple to a sickly gray. He looked at Margaret with pure hatred burning in his eyes. "This isn't over," he said, his voice shaking. "You think you've won? You've just made the biggest mistake of your life. I'll fight you in every court in Montana. I'll tie this up for so long your children will be grown before you see a penny from those claims. And when I'm done with you, when you're done, you'll be bankrupt," Sarah interrupted calmly. "Because every day you fight this, every day you tie up the courts is another day your mines sit idle, your workers go unpaid, your investors panic and pull their money. Mrs. Brennan, on the other hand, has a fully functional ore processing facility right here on her property. A facility that, once properly reopened, can process more copper in a day than your entire operation manages in a week. I've seen the machinery. I've reviewed Victoria Ashford's patents. Yes, she filed patents, properly documented and still valid. You're not just facing a legal fight, Mr. Brennan. You're facing obsolescence." It was the final blow, and Margaret saw it land. Howard's face crumpled, the bluster and rage draining away to reveal the fear underneath. He'd built his life, his identity, on being the dominant power in Copper Ridge, and in one morning that power had been stripped away, revealed as hollow and illegitimate. He climbed onto his horse without another word, his hired men following, and they rode down the mountain in a ragged, defeated line. Margaret watched them go, hardly daring to believe it was real. She'd won. Somehow, impossibly, she'd won. "Don't celebrate yet," Sarah said, though her tone was kindly. "The legal battle is just beginning. It'll be months, maybe years before everything is resolved. But you have leverage now. You have evidence, you have federal support, and you have me. We can win this, Mrs. Brennan. We can actually win this." Margaret nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Rose appeared in the doorway, having heard everything, her face showing the same stunned disbelief that Margaret felt. "Are we safe?" Rose asked. "Safe as we can be," Margaret managed. "We still have a lot of work ahead, but But yes, sweetheart, we're safe. William Torres approached, his stern expression softening slightly. Mrs. Brennan, I'll need to conduct a full inspection of the machinery you mentioned. If it's as revolutionary as these patents suggest, it could change mining operations across the country. Would you be willing to show me? Of course, Margaret said. Ellen, can you take Mr. Torres down to the basement? And Sarah, if you have time, there are more documents in Victoria Ashford's workshop. Correspondence, financial records, things that might be useful for the legal cases. As the officials went inside to begin their work, Margaret remained on the porch, breathing the cold November air, watching the morning sun finally break through the clouds and illuminate the snow-covered mountain. She thought about Victoria Ashford, about the woman who'd built an empire in this hostile place, who'd fought alone for so long before finally having to flee. Victoria had planned for this moment, had arranged events across 40 years to deliver her legacy to someone who could defend it, someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Thank you, Margaret whispered to the mountain wind, to Victoria's ghost, if it was listening. Thank you for believing someone would come. Thank you for leaving us the weapons to fight back. The house seemed to answer, its mechanical heart beating steady below, tump, tump, tump. The rhythm no longer frightening but reassuring, a promise that what Victoria had built would endure, would continue, would finally get the recognition it deserved. Ellen came back outside, a slight smile on her weathered face. Mr. Torres is beside himself down there. Keeps saying it's impossible, that hydraulic systems can't maintain pressure that long without human maintenance. But there it is, working perfectly, proving him wrong with every beat. Victoria was ahead of her time, Margaret said. No, Ellen corrected gently. Victoria was exactly on time. She just had to wait 40 years for the rest of the world to catch up, for the right person to inherit what she built. For you, Margaret. Margaret looked at her 7 children, visible through the windows now, no longer hiding in fear, but moving freely through the house that was truly theirs. She thought about the legal battles ahead, the work of reopening the mines properly, the challenge of turning Victoria's innovations into a sustainable operation. It would be hard. It would take years. But for the first time since Robert died, Margaret felt something she'd almost forgot. Hope. Real, tangible hope that they could build something here. Something that mattered, something that would honor both Robert's memory and Victoria's legacy. The Copper Queen's revolution hadn't ended when she disappeared. It had just been waiting. Waiting for a widow with nothing to lose and 7 children to protect. Waiting for someone desperate enough to believe an impossible thing. Waiting for Margaret. Spring came late to Montana in 1953, but when it finally arrived, it brought with it a transformation that seemed almost miraculous. The snow that had buried Copper Ridge for 6 months melted away to reveal a landscape ready for rebirth, and nowhere was that rebirth more evident than at the Ashford Estate. Margaret stood on the front porch, her porch now, legally and undeniably, watching as workers moved in and out of the newly reopened mine entrance that connected to Victoria's underground processing facility. These weren't the broken, desperate men who'd worked for Howard Brennan, accepting starvation wages and death trap conditions because they had no choice. These were employees of the Ashford Mining Company, hired at fair wages with safety equipment and contracts that guaranteed them treatment as human beings rather than disposable resources. The legal battle had taken 4 months to resolve, though Sarah Chen had warned it might take years. The evidence Victoria had left was simply too overwhelming, too meticulously documented to dispute. By February, a federal judge had ruled that the mineral rights to 3 major copper deposits indeed belonged to the Ashford Estate, and that Brennan Copper had been extracting ore illegally for 4 decades. The financial penalties alone had bankrupted Howard Brennan, forcing him to sell off his company's assets piece by piece just to avoid prison. Margaret had bought some of those assets, mining equipment, ore carts, tools at auction, paying pennies on the dollar with money from Victoria's gold and the first profits from her reopened operation. There was a certain poetic justice in using Brennan family property to build something better, something that honored workers rather than crushing. The hydraulic processing system that had seemed like an impossible dream now ran day and night, fed by ore from mines that Margaret operated with safety standards that made Federal Inspector Torres nod with approval during his monthly visits. The machinery that Victoria had built 40 years ago processed copper more efficiently than anything else in Montana, exactly as she'd designed it to. The steady tump, tump, tump that had once frightened Margaret's children was now the heartbeat of their prosperity, the sound of their future being built with each mechanical stroke. But it wasn't just about money, though there was plenty of that now. It was about what the money could build, what it could change. Margaret had kept her promise to Victoria, honoring the Copper Queen's memory, not with a statue or a plaque, but with action. The school she'd founded in the mansion's East Wing now educated 50 children, including her own 7, teaching them not just reading and arithmetic, but geology, engineering, and the revolutionary idea that girls could understand machines as well as boys could. The curriculum included Victoria Ashford's actual notebooks, her technical drawing, her patents, primary source material that turned the legendary Copper Queen into a real woman whose genius could be studied and emulated. The West Wing had become a refuge for miners' widows, exactly as Margaret had planned. Women whose husbands had been killed in Brennan's unsafe mines now had a place to stay, job training, and employment in the Ashford Mining Company's company's offices and support operations. Margaret hired them as bookkeepers, as safety inspectors, as shift supervisors, positions that mine owners across Montana insisted only men could fill, but which these women performed with a competence that made those owners look foolish. Ellen McKenna, now officially Margaret's business partner and the company's chief operations officer, had proven to be as shrewd about business as she was about everything else. Together, they'd built something that mining journals were calling the Montana model, a way of operating that prioritized worker safety and fair pay while still turning substantial profit. Other mine owners scoffed at first, predicting bankruptcy within months. But when the Ashford Mining Company's productivity and profit margins exceeded theirs, the scoffing turned to grudging interest, then to imitation. Change, Margaret was learning, didn't always require revolution. Sometimes it just required proving there was a better way and being successful enough that others had to pay attention. Victoria's workshop in the basement had become Margaret's own laboratory, where she continued the work the Copper Queen had started. With the help of engineers from the State University, men and women both, as Margaret insisted on gender equality in her hiring, she'd begun refining Victoria's hydraulic systems, making them more efficient, more scalable, suitable for operations beyond just copper mining. They'd filed 3 new patents in the past year alone, all credited to V. Ashford and M. Brennan, inventors, ensuring that Victoria's name would live on in the engineering advances her work made possible. The house itself had been restored to something beyond its former glory. The rooms that had seemed so empty and haunted were now full of life. Children's laughter, women's voices, the constant traffic of workers and teachers and business associates. The mechanical heart below no longer seemed ominous, but vital, essential, the engine that powered not just ore processing, but social change. Margaret's children had thrived in ways she'd hardly dared imagine during those desperate first days. Rose, now 15, had shown such aptitude for engineering that she was working as Ellen's apprentice, learning the mining business from the ground up with an eye toward eventually taking over operations. Jacob and Peter had found their calling in safety inspection, walking the tunnels daily to ensure that no worker would die the way their father had. The younger girls were excelling in the school, and even little Samuel, now 3, toddled around the mansion like he owned it, which in a sense he did. They'd buried Robert properly in the spring, moving his body from the company cemetery where Howard had dumped him with minimal ceremony to a place of honor on the mansion grounds, next to where Margaret planned to someday place a memorial for Victoria Ashford. The headstone was simple but honest. Robert Brennan, loving husband and father, killed by greed and negligence, remembered with love. Standing at his grave now, 6 months after their arrival at the estate, Margaret told him about everything that had happened, about how his death, as terrible as it was, had led them to Victoria's legacy, about how their children would grow up educated, safe, with opportunities he'd never had, about how his sacrifice, unwilling though it was, had helped break the Brennan family's stranglehold on Copper Ridge and create something better. "I wish you were here," she said softly, touching the cold stone. "You'd be so proud of them, of what we've built. Victoria left us the tools, but you gave me the strength to use them. Every time I wanted to give up, every time I was afraid, I thought about you and what you'd want for our children. That's what kept me fighting." The wind through the mountain pines was her only answer, but it was enough. Robert was at peace, and so was she, finally, with his loss and with the unexpected path that loss had forced her down. Sarah Chen visited monthly from Helena, handling the ongoing legal work and becoming a friend in the process. She'd helped Margaret navigate the treacherous waters of property law, mineral rights, and corporate structure, setting up the Ashford Mining Company as a worker-owned cooperative where employees had a stake in the profits they helped generate. It was a radical idea, but it worked. Productivity was higher because workers cared about the results. Safety was better because they looked out for each other, and loyalty was absolute because they knew Margaret saw them as partners rather than tools. "You've started something remarkable here," Sarah said during her latest visit, sitting in the study that had once been Victoria's and was now Margaret's. "Other mining operations are paying attention. Some are even starting to implement similar policy. You're changing an entire industry." "Victoria started it," Margaret corrected. "I'm just finishing what she began, making sure her innovations aren't lost, that her name is remembered for the right reasons instead of the superstitious nonsense people believe." "The Copper Queen would be proud," Sarah said with a smile. 2 women, 40 years apart, refusing to accept the limitations men tried to put on them. Building something that matters, something that lasts. That's a legacy worth having. Margaret thought about that later, walking through the mansion that had seemed so frightening 7 months ago and was now so familiar, so full of life and purpose. She paused at Victoria's portrait, looking up at the woman who'd left her this impossible gift. "I hope I'm doing right by you," Margaret said to the painted face. "I hope this is what you wanted, not just the machinery running, but people's lives getting better. Workers being safe, women having opportunity, your genius being recognized and built upon rather than buried and forgotten." The portrait didn't answer, but Margaret felt a sense of rightness, of completion. Victoria had fought alone, had been forced to disappear because she couldn't win her battles in 1912, but she'd planted seeds, left weapons, created possibility. And Margaret, arriving with nothing but desperation and determination, had been able to harvest what Victoria planted. To win the battles Victoria Victoria couldn't fight. Together, across 4 decades, they'd created something revolutionary. Proof that women could understand complex machinery, could run successful businesses, could compete with and surpass men who tried to keep them powerless. More than that, they'd proven that success didn't require crushing workers, that you could run a profitable operation while treating employees like human beings with dignity and rights. The Ashford Mining Company was growing, expanding, becoming a model that other operations studied and, increasingly, imitated. Margaret had received inquiries from mining companies across the West, asking about her method, her machinery, her management structure. She shared freely, holding nothing back, because Victoria's revolution wasn't meant to enrich just one woman. It was meant to change the entire system. As spring turned to summer and the mountains blazed with wildflowers, Margaret stood once more on the porch where she'd faced down Howard Brennan and his hired thug. Ellen stood beside her, and Sarah had come from Helena for a visit, and Margaret's 7 children played in the yard, their laughter carrying on the mountain breeze. "Do you ever miss it?" Ellen asked. "The simplicity of just being a miner's wife, not having all this responsibility." Margaret considered the question seriously. Life was certainly more complicated now. She made decisions that affected hundreds of lives. She navigated legal challenges and business negotiations and the constant resistance of men who still couldn't accept that women could do what she was doing. The weight of it was real, the stress constant. "No," she said finally, "I don't miss it, because that life ended the day Robert died, and there was no going back to it anyway. This," she gestured at the mansion, the mines, the workers coming and going, her children thriving. "This is harder, but it's also real. It's meaningful. Every day I wake up knowing that what I do matters, that I'm building something that will outlast me, that I'm proving something important about what's possible." "Victoria would say you're proving something about what women are capable of," Sarah observed. "Maybe," Margaret agreed, "but more than that, I'm proving something about what happens when you give people, any people, regardless of gender, the tools and the opportunity and the respect they deserve. They build remarkable things. They change the world." The mechanical heartbeat below continued its steady rhythm. Tump, tump, tump. Victoria's genius still beating strong after 41 years, now joined by Margaret's vision for what that genius could create. The Copper Queen's revolution hadn't ended when she disappeared into history. It had just been waiting for the right moment, the right person, the right combination, desperation and courage to carry it forward. Waiting for a widow with 7 children and nothing to lose except everything. Waiting for Margaret Brennan to inherit not just a house, but a future. And that future, built on the foundation of 2 women's determination to be more than what the world expected, was just beginning. Years later, when Margaret was old and her children had children of their own, when the Ashford Mining Company employed thousands across Montana and its worker safety standards had become law across the industry, people would ask her how she'd done it, how she'd gone from homeless widow to mining mag, from powerless to powerful, from victim to victor. And she would always tell them the same thing: "I inherited a haunted house from a woman they called a witch, and I discovered that the ghosts were just machinery, the curses were just lies, and the witch was just a brilliant woman who refused to accept limitation. Everything I built on her foundation. I just had the courage to look beneath the floorboards and claim what she'd left for me." The Copper Queen's legacy lived on, not in copper extracted or wealth accumulated, but in lives changed, in possibilities created, in the revolutionary idea that women's genius and men's greed weren't the only options. There was a third way Victoria had shown and Margaret had proved: the way of intelligence, fairness, courage, and the absolute refusal to accept that things had to stay the way they'd always been. That was the real inheritance. That was what changed everything.